I come here today because tomorrow is the formal start of the Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia. And we certainly wish all of our athletes well. We have a few from Florida, believe it or not. The Sunshine State has contributed a number of athletes to the Winter Olympic efforts of our country. We wish them all the best, and we pray for their safety. We've all read media reports of the potential for attacks. We pray that that does not happen. And of course, our government has tried to be as cooperative as possible with the Russian government in providing some level of security assistance. They've been less than open about that. So we hope and pray that things will go well there. And let me just say at the outset, Olympics should never be politicized. I hope that these are not either. And so my comments today are not about the Olympics per se, but I do think it's an important time, given where they're occurring, to take a moment to reflect on the nature and on our nation's relationship with the host country, with Russia, because they're going to be in the news a lot over the next few days. Now, we've all heard the debates about some of the more extreme examples of intolerance that exist within Russia, particularly as a result of President Vladimir Putin and his government. But I wanted to take a moment to describe where I think the relations between the United States and Russia stands, and particularly how Russia views itself, their government, I should say, in the world. And at the outset, let me begin by saying that when I talk about governments, when I talk about countries like Russia or China, for that matter, we are talking about the government leaders, not the people. In fact, we know that in both of those countries, and especially in Russia, in both countries, in China as well, but in many other countries, there are people who do not like the direction that their political leadership is taking them. In fact, I would say that in countries like Russia and China, it might be the majority of people who strongly disagree with the direction that its so-called leaders are taking them. What we talk about here is our relationship with their governments, and in this case, our relationship with Vladimir Putin and the decisions that he has made. Now, the best way to understand the situation with Russia is primarily a president who has nationalistic tendencies in Putin that wants Russia to somehow reclaim what he views as its glory days of world prominence. And he believes and has concluded that the best way to do that is to be antagonistic and outright hostile towards the United States. As part of that plan, by the way, is an effort to create among his neighbors, particularly those republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union, to bring them under Russia's sphere of influence. So you have two stunning examples of that over the last few years. The first is the Republic of Georgia, which they invaded a few years ago, and even now occupy territory within it. In fact, as part of these Olympics, one of the things Russia has done is it has sealed off portions of Georgian territory that they claim they need for a security buffer. It's completely outrageous. But that's happening with very little attention on the international stage. The other thing is to see what's happening in Ukraine and how they used the threat of non-cooperation economically and even subterfuge economically to try to force Ukraine to reject a deal to integrate with the European Union and instead seek to be a part of this new thing that the Russian government is trying to create. As part of that agenda as well, they have viewed themselves as the need to be antagonistic towards the United States. But in the process of doing that, not only have they been antagonistic towards the United States, they have been antagonistic towards the cause of human rights and of world peace. And there are some stunning examples. Certainly within Russia, we have seen the targeting and the oppression of everything from a rock band to journalists. We know the story of Sergei Magnitsky, who was doing nothing more than investigating rampant official corruption. We saw how that happened with him. We've seen who they line up with on the international stage. For example, they are perhaps, other than Iran, and perhaps equal with Iran, the most important supporter of Assad and of what he's doing in Syria. The slaughter of innocent civilians, over 100,000 people dead, hundreds of thousands of others now living in refugee camps, displaced from their homes. This is who the Russian president and the Russian government have lined up with. Beyond that, we should see the attitude they've taken towards Iran. They have not been, despite the administration's assertions, productive in dealing with Iran's nuclear ambitions. On the contrary, they have been supportive, or at a minimum, have been a roadblock to progress being made with regards to preventing a nuclear Iran. And so on issue after issue, we see this Russian government lining itself up, diametrically opposed, not just to the interests of the United States, but to the interests of the cause of world peace. How could you possibly? Now, I understand that the situation in Syria is complicated, but how could you possibly express yourself to be such a strong and blind ally of a killer, of a murderer, of a criminal like Assad? Now, there are problems in those rebel groups, too. There are some terrorists involved in that. In fact, unfortunately, it appears they've grown in predominance among the rebellion. It's not an easy issue to confront, but at a minimum, you would expect that a country that believes in human rights and the dignity of all people would, at a minimum, add their voice to the condemnation of what's occurring in Syria, the conduct of the Assad government. Instead, they have been involved in trying to pursue ridiculous conspiracy theories like the notion that somehow the chemical attacks that occurred there were not conducted by Assad and his regime. And so beyond those things, what they've done at home and what they've done abroad, what have they done directly towards the United States? Well, let's talk about what they've done towards their neighbors and the constant threats on their neighbors. And in some instances, the willingness to carry it out by invading the Republic of Georgia. And then, of course, you turn to their relationship with us. What have they done? Well, a couple things bear watching. The first is what they've done with their weapons systems. They continue to invest an extraordinary amount of money for a country that's going through the economic challenges that they're confronting to build up their conventional weapons capabilities. Again, sending naval forces to all different parts of the world, trying to flex some muscle. Now, it's not as powerful as the Soviet Union, but they're trying to project power in that way. And usually they find places to project power that they know would somehow challenge the strategic interests of the United States. And then last week, we read in the New York Times that there is evidence that they may be in violation of an arms control agreement. In the face of all of these things, the initial attitude of this administration was, we need to reset policy towards Russia. And understand what was behind that idea. What was behind that idea was the notion that the reason why we didn't have a good relationship with Putin and with Russia and the Russian government is because the U.S., because the previous president, George W. Bush, was too abrasive. By the way, this is not just for Russia. This is kind of a theory they applied all over the world. And if we could just reset that relationship, if we could just be more cooperative with them, if we could show them that we were more willing to talk and be open-minded, that somehow that would affect their behavior. And let me tell you what Putin and their government did. They did what any good former KGB agent would do. They took what you offered them and kept doing what they wanted. They took what it is you were, whatever concessions you were putting on the table, and they kept doing whatever they wanted. And what's stunning to me is not just the administration's unwillingness to acknowledge that the reset policy has not worked, but in some instances, their desire to double down on it. The president continues to talk about additional reductions in strategic weapons vis-a-vis the Russians. And yet, last week we hear, as I just said a moment ago, that they're probably already in violation of an existing agreement. We've allowed them to convince us not to pursue anti-missile technologies or advanced and additional anti-missile technologies and defense systems in Eastern Europe. Our allies, by the way, look at us and say, well, what's going on? It adds to this air of instability. It adds to this questions that now exist. It adds to the notion that we have become an unreliable ally in the world, because other countries are watching this as well, and they're taking note. This is the situation that we face now. And I think because the Olympics are in Russia, the whole world is about to see it. Now, for example, we can't say for sure that this has anything to do with the government, but last night, so we read a report today in the Wall Street Journal that one of its reporters, in the middle of the night, someone opened the door to their room. And I think you're going to have, and tried to walk in for a moment. Now, again, do we know that was the Russian government or not? No, we don't know that for sure. But here's what we do know. That seems to be a recurring issue there. This sort of surveillance state where everybody, where opposition is oppressed and people are watched. where political opponents could be arrested and jailed or exiled. The Russian government is starting to look more and more every day in its attitude like the former Soviet Union in its behavior. And I think we have a right to be concerned about it. Now, look, when I come to the floor and talk about these issues, and other my colleagues do, this is not because we want confrontation. On the contrary, we hope to avoid all these things. We have plenty of issues to focus on in this country. But we cannot be naive. We must never forget the lessons of history that teach us that when behavior like this and attitudes like this go unaddressed, when your potential adversaries sense weakness and insecurity and indecisiveness, it invites them to be even more aggressive, and it invites them to miscalculate. And so I do believe that while the Olympics are an issue that should not be politicized, our relationship with Russia is one that deserves serious attention in this body. This idea that somehow this is a relic of Cold War issues and that we shouldn't be focused on it in the same way is naive. They still have an enormous nuclear arsenal. They still have a significant conventional military capability, and they have someone running their government who is not an ally or a friend of the United States. On the contrary, he has come to believe that what is bad for the United States is good for Russia. And we should not be naive about that in our dealings. And we should not under any circumstances betray or undermine or abandon our commitment to our allies in the region and to the countries that are Russia's neighbors for the sake of seeking to improve the relationship with the Russian government, because they will continue to do what they have already done. They will take your concessions and they will keep doing whatever they want. And so I hope that as a part of this week's and the next couple weeks and this Olympics, that we as policymakers, with all the issues happening in our country and all the challenges we face around the world, I hope we will take more time to truly examine the nature of this government in Russia and what our relationship should be towards them.